and gentlemen, welcome to another evening of discussions here at the Greenville Library. My name is Larry Bounds, and I'll help out a bit as your moderator today. A few bits of business to mention beforehand. If you would, silence your cell phones so that, we can have an undisturbed, and I'll do the same thing here. I'll set by example there. Slide to power off. Okay. If I try the one about airplane mode or whatever, it ends up still making noise. So I thought I'd go that way. But however you would like to do that. Sit on it so it's muffled. However you want to do that. Also, a thanks to the Greenville County Library for sponsoring our Tuesday talks. I do want to point out, so you probably saw them on the way in, there are materials back there about our subject, Nellie Bly, that are available for checkout. And so if you have a library card, you've got a key to get those books. And if you don't have a library card, they have ways of getting library cards up at the front. So see, you're covered. You can go home tonight with a wonderful book to read if you like, or on any other subject here. Let's see. On my little checklist. Also, I was going to mention this anyway, so I'm glad it's on my list. This arrived in my mailbox today. And how many of you got one today? You did? All right. Some people haven't. If you're on our mailing list, you're going to get one of these. This is the official reader, the program for the Summer Chautauqua program, where it's got information about the presenters and the schedule, and you've got in here articles about each of the characters that will be presenting this year with suggested readings and famous quotes and timelines and all this wonderful information about this exotic group of characters that are coming, and a list of all the shows that we've done in the past. So you have an idea to look over and go, oh, gee, I really wish I was here in 1999 and had a chance to see Dorothy Parker and James Thurber. Because I'm sure everybody wished they had had an evening with... Anyway, I'll go on. All right, so... and of course, all of you can receive one of these in the mail. You sign up for our mailing list. We don't sell the list to anybody else. You can sign up for the mailing list and you'll receive goodies like this, and you won't get like car purchase things from us. So, and also, I guess my next job is to introduce our speaker for this evening on the subject of Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly, by the way, I will mention this as a shout out to my wife, who may or may not be watching this at the moment online. She suggested many years ago that we should have Nellie Bly. My wife has a degree in journalism. She was a former newspaper editor herself, and she always thought Nellie Bly would be a great person. And we have found someone to perform as her this year that I think you will all find particularly excellent. But tonight we're going to have a chance to hear about some of the effect that Nellie Bly had on America's and the world's journalism, investigative journalism. But you'll find out. All right. So the person who's going to be telling us about this is a professor at Furman. She teaches digital storytelling. She teaches broadcast journalism. She has worked for over 20 years as an investigative reporter herself. She has won regional awards, won national awards in her for her investigative journalism. So she knows the subject well. She is a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and also a graduate school at Arizona State University, which is the Walter School of Journalism. So, hey, cool, right? So she knows about journalism. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Mary Sturgill.
Thank you, Larry. All right. I feel like I'm so far above you guys. So as Larry said, hopefully this doesn't hinder us too much. As Larry said, I graduated from the Walter Cronkite High School. with a degree in journalism and mass communications. And then I went to work in journalism for about 20 years before I retired from that. And now I teach journalism at Furman. So today I want to talk to you about how investigative journalism was influenced by Nellie Bly, but also how it's changed through the years, even during my career. Okay. The topics for the presentation: Nellie Bly and investigative journalism. We'll talk, and I'll show you several of my investigations, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about the trends in investigative journalism that we're seeing now and how they're going in a little bit different direction, but it might be a good thing, right? And then we'll have time for question and answer. All right. So instead of reinventing the wheel, because I am by no means a Nellie Bly scholar, I found this cute little video done by students. So I thought I would show you this as a brief history for Nellie Bly. All right. So I thought that was cute. Let me escape that and get back to our main show here. So a couple of things Nellie Bly did. First of all, she went undercover. Right? She went into the insane asylum. Only one person knew she was there. Very, very dangerous acquisition, right? To only one person know that you're there and know that you're really sane. She acted insane, got herself in. And at that point in time, I mean, I know you know history. So at that point in time, women acted a little weird. They were thought to be insane, right? So it probably wasn't very hard to get in. Might have been a little more difficult to get out, but she was able to get out. So that's the first thing that she did, was she went undercover, right, and was able to shed light where light needed to be shed, right, on the conditions that these women were facing in these hospitals. That allowed laws to be changed. Right. So then people started looking at, okay, if this needs light shed on it, then other things need light shed on them too. Right. Then she did her own experience of traveling around the world. Right. So she did the experience herself as an investigation to see how it would go. Right. And she shared her story. I've done a couple of those where I did a couple of procedures myself for our audience. And I didn't know you remember when Katie Couric had the colonoscopy on air. And that's that kind of journalism. The reporter puts themselves in the position so that the audience knows what to expect, right? And then, of course, the working conditions, the ERA, all of which she was super passionate about as well. So all of that affected how we do journalism today, especially investigative journalism. So when I started out back in the early 2000s, I did my first probably big investigation was actually, this should be transposed, should be meth epidemic in Idaho. And so for this epidemic, or for this investigative piece, what I did was I looked at years of stats from police departments around East Idaho where I lived. And I looked at Montana and I saw how they kind of investigated their own stuff. And I kind of patterned my investigation after that. And so I went to drug addiction facilities and talked to people. I went to and got 2 people on camera, one of which I had to hide his identity because of his job. He didn't want to risk losing his job and didn't want them to know that he was an addict fighting his addiction. And the other one did not mind going on camera because she was self-employed. So I investigated that, talked to them, found out what Montana was doing to fight the epidemic at the time, because Idaho was behind Montana on this, and did the story and shed light on the fact that police agencies around our part of the state, and actually the entire state, were seeing this upward trend in meth. And they were making more busts, they were finding more addicts, more overdoses. And so I looked at all of those numbers and I collected all of those numbers for a series of 3 years, right? And that's the story that I told. I don't have the video because it was before digital. So I'll tell you about that. The second one that I did was sex offenders on MySpace. And this tells you how old this is, right? So what I did was I cross-referenced the sex offender registry in Idaho and MySpace within a 25-mile radius is what the parameters I put into the sex offender registry. Within 2 minutes, I found 50 sex offenders. And then within 30 minutes, I found 25 of them had MySpace accounts. And exactly. And they're not supposed to be on the internet, right? So that was the first part of the investigation. That investigation really didn't take too long because it really popped right up. And then all I had to do was cross-reference names. So I'm looking at data that's already been collected. I didn't have to collect the data other than doing the searches on MySpace, right? So I did the searches on MySpace, found driver's license photographs, compared whatever photograph I could find. A lot of times it was driver's license because I did a background check. Made sure that they were the person, in fact, that was listed on the sex offender registry, birth date and everything. And then I chose 5 or 6 of them, and I went to knock on their doors and ask them why they were on MySpace being against the law and breaking their probation. That was fun. I had, at the time, this is a very small market, right? So I was at the time what you call a one-man band. Now we call them multimedia journalists. But back in that time, I was a one-man band. So my news director was like, Mary, I don't really think you should go be knocking on people's doors by yourself. And I'm like, right, send somebody with me, please. And so he sent one of our other reporters with me. And if anything had happened, this guy couldn't have saved me because he was kind of a wimp. But I hope he doesn't see this. I doubt he will. But so anyway, we knocked on some doors, and some of the people were obvious. They were really up to no good, right? And you could kind of tell the ones. And then we knocked on this one door where I could tell it was a kid whose the girlfriend's parents had gotten him in trouble, right? I mean, he'd gotten in trouble, but his girlfriend's parents had pressed the issue. So we walked away. I taped my asking the question and stuff, and we walked away, and he chased us because he realized what was going on after I talked to him. And I have every right to talk to him because I did not go into the apartment. He invited me in, but I knew if I was in there, that would not, one, be safe for me. But two, I wouldn't have the ability to film him as freely as I would have on the sidewalk, right? Because Idaho's a one-party state, meaning I could film him as long as he's in public, right? So he chased us down. We were about to our car, and I said to Noah, put the camera in the car. And I said it like 3 times. And I turned around to face the guys who were coming up. And he wanted the camera. He wanted to erase the footage. And I knew I wasn't going to use that footage because it really wasn't that good. And I told him, I said, I will promise you I'm not going to use the footage. And he was like, well, how do I believe you? And I said, well, my word is my bond. So you can believe it. But I'm not running the risk of you erasing the rest of my footage that I need for this piece. But I promise you I will not use your footage. So I de-escalated the situation, and I kept my word. I did not use that footage in that piece because I didn't need it, right? But my fellow journalist stood there and froze and didn't put the camera in the car. And I'm like, put the camera in the car and close the car, right? So you do put yourself in those situations when you go to hunt people down, which you have to do sometimes, right? To give them the opportunity to tell their side of the story as well. So once I talked to him and I heard his side of the story, I knew he wasn't necessarily the predator that the other people were, right, who were on MySpace. That story won an SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists Award for investigative journalism in our markets, in small markets. So that was my first big story that got some notoriety. And then, this was several years after that, right after Bernie Madoff, there was another Ponzi scheme that not many people know about. But the New York Times picked it up. But before they picked it up, I did a story on it. And this was also out of Idaho. And this guy had been, of course, talking people into investing money with him and then not investing the money, right? So in this particular investigation, my news director had already given the story to a Cub reporter, somebody who was brand new. And she went to some people. And so the response that she got was, oh, there's not a story here. Nothing's really going on here. There's not a story. Well, as an investigative journalist, if somebody tells me that, I know there is a story, and I'll be the one to decide that, right? So my news director then came to me and said, Mary, will you go get this story? So I went and I called the people, my contacts, that I knew information about this. And I got one of the guys to speak with some anonymity. And then I went and I had my people lined up. I had my quotes from them. I had my sound bites from them. And then the last piece of that investigation was to go knock on this guy's door again, because you have to give him the opportunity to defend himself, right? I can't just say all these people say you stole their money, right? Without him allowing him at least to try to give his side. So again, I'm still an MMJ or one-man band at this time. My news director and our general manager went with me this time because they were like, we're not going to let you go out there by yourself. So while I'm knocking on this guy's door, my news director is acting as the cameraman and our general manager is acting as my bodyguard. So this is that story. Okay. So the Ponzi scheme, the reason I said 50 million to 100 million was because the people that I talked to estimated 75 million, but they also believed that it could be more, really up to 150 million, right? But no one knew for sure because the investigation of that into that was still ongoing. Okay. Any questions about those? Yeah. It turned out to be like 150 million. Yeah, and he went to jail. I can't do it because that was before digital. So that was before digital. So I have it on one of those mini recording tapes. So, and I can't I need to find somebody who can put it on digital for me. I did keep all of my stories throughout my years. But many of them are on those little mini tapes that I have to find something that can convert them. Sadly, because I would like to go back and see some of them and see the difference and the quality difference. You can just totally tell, right? All right, so I moved from Idaho to Texas and Beaumont, Texas, if any of you are familiar with it, close to Louisiana. And we covered lots of crime down there. And I was a main anchor, and then I did special investigations. So I didn't do daily stories like I did in Idaho, but I would do like month-long investigations, which I did some in Idaho as well. That Ponzi scheme took a little bit of time to put together. So the first one I want to show you is called Stolen Lives. The way that, and it's about human trafficking, so trigger warning. The way that I came upon this story is my church happened to be, and I was a new member of this church, happened to be raising funds for a shelter for women who were saved from human trafficking. And so my pastor, when I first went to the church, told me about this and connected me to the woman who was heading up that project in our church. And she actually already worked with human trafficked survivors. And so she was able to connect me with the person who you're going to see in the piece, Amy, and her. I did change their names. Amy, I changed to Lisa, or vice versa. I can't remember which. Lisa is the person who's putting together Harvest House, which is the place where the women will go. And then I changed Amy's name because even though she had been out of human trafficking for over a year and actually been out of Beaumont for over a year, it was still very dangerous for her. So one of the tenets of journalism is to, one, protect your sources, right? And cause no harm. And so I didn't want, by using her name and her likeness, I did not want to cause her more harm. I didn't want her, basically abductors and her traffickers to come find her, right? So I hid her identity, which you will see in here. Now, I will tell you, as a result of the sex offenders on MySpace, the local sheriff's department came to me and wanted my research. Because in Idaho, it's against the law for anybody on the sex offender registry to be on the internet, to have access to the internet even in Idaho. And so they came to me asking for my research, and I'm like, well, you could do the research yourself. And of course, our news director made them do the research themselves. So Stolen Lives, the way I did my interviews first with the people, because I had no idea where to go to find human trafficking happening, right? And turns out it was like 3 blocks away from the nicest neighborhood in Beaumont. But So I went and I did my interviews first, which I'm sure Nellie, to take it back to Nellie Bly, which I'm sure she did too. She had to have talked to someone about the hospital to find out the conditions about the hospital, right? And that spurred her interest in going in, right? Just like this spurred my interest in this particular thing. And I would always, and I'm sure she did this too, I would always find another story when I'm on a story, right? Or just in conversations with people, right? So so I went in, I did my interviews with Lisa, and I went and did my interview with the person who had been saved. And then I went to the place. I didn't have to go undercover, but I did have to do a stakeout for about 5 nights. And so I would do my anchoring, and then I would go home, grab a bite to eat, and then we'd go, once it got dark, we'd go stake out the places where she told me to go. So before we started the stakeout, I did a little stakeout to see get the lay of the land, right? So it turns out it happened at a Waffle House. And so what I did was I went to the Waffle House, acted like because I was recognizable, right, in that community because I was a main anchor. So I just went into the Waffle House midday and got a soda, kind of looked at what you could see from inside the Waffle House to kind of scope out where we could park our car. And what you could see from where, right? So we drove around. So when I walk into the Waffle House, there is a gentleman sitting. So here's the counter. There's a gentleman sitting here, an older gentleman. There's a young girl sitting here. And my human traffic survivor told me some things to look for, right? That I didn't have any idea about before I talked to her. And one of the things was to, 1, look for a young girl. 2, no purse, no real identification of any kind, no possessions, right? She had nothing with her except for her iPod that she was listening to, right? So when me and my photographer pulled in, he parked. I asked him not to park beside this guy, but he did anyway. He parked beside this guy who was sitting in the car smoking, right? And so I got out and he wanted to smoke a cigarette. So I said, go ahead, I'll go in and kind of see what I see, and ordered a Coke. Well, it took her a long time to serve me. The guy in the car came in and walked past and actually physically bumped my shoulder when he walked past me. There was plenty of room for him to do that. So when I realized the girl might be someone who's being trafficked, I thought, okay, then that must have been her pimp out in the car. But I was wrong. It was the older gentleman who was super nice and super chatty with me when I went into the Waffle House. So I knew it was happening. And so we drove around the next couple of nights, did some stakeout. We saw his car several times, but we could never get them stopping anywhere, right? So finally, like on the 4th night, we were staked out in front of the Waffle House, unmarked car, not in a news car, right? In an unmarked car. And I saw the girl, the exact same girl, and we found her ad on back page because that's where they used to advertise the girls before it was shut down. So we found what I believe was her ad, right? And then, so I did that, looked at there and found that data. And then we staked out and I saw her walk. I saw a truck pull in, and you'll see part of this video and then we'll talk about why I couldn't use part of it, but we saw it. Truck pulled in. The SUV that the older gentleman was in, that was in the original night we were at the Waffle House, that vehicle pulled around the Waffle House, through the alley and down to a gas station that was kind of diagonal behind us. And then she walked down the alley and got in the truck with the guy and left, right? So that's what we saw. And so here's the investigation. All right, so the results of that investigation was, 1, it opened a lot of people's eyes because nobody knew that human trafficking was that prevalent in our little town, right? That was 2013. And this was before any human trafficking task force were organized. As a result of that particular story, a human trafficking task force was organized in Southeast Texas, and 2 state laws were changed so that women who were arrested for prostitution, if they were being held captive and being forced into sex trade, they would not get a prostitution charge. Most of the women who were arrested for prostitution and drugs because their drug dealer or their pimps get them hooked on drugs, right? either by force and then they're hooked, or that maybe they seek people out who have a drug problem already, right? Who are easy prey, and that kind of thing. So the law changed so that, because what was happening to these women is that their lives were taken away. They were forced to do these things. They didn't get to keep any of the money, right? I asked Amy about her pimps, and she said, I mean, her Johns, and she said, many of them were very nice. One of them actually gave me extra money and allowed me time to go hide it from my pimp. And so I went in a certain park and hid it under a rock. But if she was too late, then her pimp would get suspicious and he would beat her, right? And as a matter of fact, the day that she was arrested, her pimp had taken a friend's car and not given it back, and she told the friend where the car was. And so as a result of ratting him out, so to speak, he broke her jaw, broke her arm, broke her nose, and left her in the street. And that's when she was arrested. And she was arrested because she had a little bit of drugs on her, right? So she went to jail, and then she went to kind of a halfway house for over a year to stay away because it's still dangerous for her to come back. And even when I spoke with her, she felt like she was still in danger because he would come after her. I did learn that there are two kinds of pimps. And one is, well, both are frightening, but one is called a gorilla pimp who, sure. There are two kinds of pimps. That is what I learned. One is called a gorilla pimp, and they use force, right? The other is called a boyfriend pimp. And so these people act like they're someone's boyfriend or good friend, and then before they know it, they are being sold, right, against their will. Lisa told me one story about a girl who was a waitress, a young girl in college, was a waitress, had a regular customer, an older gentleman who talked to her almost every day for months at months. And then one day he said to her, "Hey, I have a grandson you should meet," and brought this grandson in. And that grandson became her boyfriend and talked her into going on vacation with him. And it turns out that he was taking her to Colorado to a party to meet his friends. But what it was a place where she was sold to a trafficker who was then going to take her to Arizona. Her ex-boyfriend smelled a rat, basically, and called her parents and said, "This is not right, something's up," right? And they went and got her. It was crazy. So, but that's how easy it happens, right? So there were no laws to protect any of these women, and this investigation helps change that, right? Sometimes when they're started. Lisa was not a minor, and the law is kind of icky in this area, right? Because it says if they're minors, they're not going to be charged with prostitution. But like Lisa, she was a minor, I think 17 when she started, so almost of age, but not quite. Well, and that's the problem. She was an adult at this time. But some of the people who are human trafficked for years, right? So they may have started when they were minors, but by the time they're arrested and getting out, they may be adults. So according to the way the Texas law was written, they would still be charged because when they were arrested. So that's problematic with the law that I see, right? Is that you need to look at when they were taken into this life, right? Any questions about that one? Any more questions? So I will say that's probably one of my proudest investigations because it had one of the biggest changes. That it really shed light on a problem that people were sticking their head in the sand about. Because one of the other things that I learned in doing that investigation was that these drug dealers are, in addition to selling drugs, are getting into human trafficking because drugs dry up. But if you have a person, you can sell that person over and over again. Once you sell a drug, it's gone, right? So Officer Ornelas was telling me that these things are going hand in hand, right? Because when the drugs are dried up, they can still sell the women. So South Carolina now has a human trafficking task force. I've done multiple stories with them and investigations with them. So since then, it's spread across the country and people are doing things to try to stop it. And that's why journalists do their job, right? Is to shed light on these things so that change can be made, positive change can be made. So the next one I would like to talk about is cancer killing our heroes. And I came upon this one because I did a story with the Firemen's Foundation down in Columbia Association, and on PTSD and first responders and PTSD. And my father was a first responder. He was a firefighter, and he died of cancer. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And so then when I was talking to them about the PTSD story, and this is where I talk about finding a story when I'm doing a story, right? They were telling me about this conference that they have every year, and they were getting ready to have it a couple weeks away from the time I did that story. And one of the presenters was a woman who was trying to raise awareness about the connection between cancer and firefighters, and the fact that so many firefighters are dying of cancer. And I thought, well, that hits close to home, right? So let's check this out and let's find out what's going on. I begged my news director probably 2 months to do this story. I was anchoring the weekend, went to the conference. I didn't have permission to do the story yet. But I went to the conference and I shot the interview and I shot her presentation at the conference because I was determined to do the story, right? So I just kept pitching it. I was like, one of these days she's going to say yes, right? So finally, I'd gotten her interview. I'd found other people, and I was doing all of this on my own time, not on company time, and because I cared so much about the story. And finally, she said, "Go ahead and do the story. I think I wore it down." So I did the story. And so what this entailed was collecting the data, because I couldn't, there was no database anywhere in the state that had who was a firefighter and who had died of cancer or who had cancer, right? So I created my own. And I emailed all of the fire departments, many of which were volunteer, in our viewing area. And I asked them to self-report to me. Some of them refused, right? But many of them, because they feel like it's such a huge issue, asked their members and they wanted to report. So this is what I found out. So as a result of that story, South Carolina started a database, and people began to ask firefighters, because most of our firefighters are volunteer, so they have another job. So instead of just putting their job, truck driver, school teacher, whatever, on these forms, they were encouraged to also share that you're a firefighter, right? Because that's the piece of data that was getting lost. Insurance law has now been changed as well. And I believe I read even just last week that a firefighter who died of cancers, insurance had to pay because it was proven that the firefighting directly caused the cancer. Right. So two things happened. One, the database was started, and two, a law was changed the year after that. A year after I did this story, I was the first person to ever do a story on this. And the year after I did it, my news director called me and said, "Hey, Mary, National is finally doing your firefighter story." And I was like, well, it's about time, because this is a huge problem, right? Any questions about that one? All the time. What's that old adage in journalism? If you haven't made people mad, then you're not doing your job, right? So yeah, all the time. There are people, insurance companies, did not want this to happen, right? They didn't want this data to be collected. The technology, as Cindy L said, was catching up to us, basically, in the fact that they could really pinpoint which cancers were caused directly by what carcinogen, right? And if that firefighter, you had to go through a lot to prove that you fought a fire that had that particular carcinogen, right? And that you were exposed. There's also been changes in how firefighters themselves do things, right? They are making bigger budgets for uniforms, because uniforms do wear out, but you have to wash them. They have special washing machines for the uniforms, right? So they're taking all the precautions that they can take on their end, right? So that's changed through the years, because my dad also drove around in our car with his gear in the back of the car, right? Just like those guys. My dad was a volunteer. Yeah. So it's not just the professional firefighters. There are more firefighters who are volunteers than professionals, right? So those people have to be looked after too, right? All right. So some investigative trends. My last stop before I retired from journalism was in Colombia. And when I first started working, my company and state, not when I first started working, but when I was working in Beaumont, our company was bought by Gannett. It was called Gannett at the time. Huge newspapers, owned a lot of TV stations. This is when, and we're still merging, right? 2008, even before 2008, media companies were merging like crazy. Big newspapers were buying up all the little newspapers, and all of that was going on, right? Same thing was happening with TV stations. And they were cutting salaries. I actually lost my job when that happened, right? Because they couldn't afford to pay me, and I wasn't even making that much, right? And then I ended up moving to Texas got another job. But when Gannett bought us, and then I moved to Columbia within the company split into Gannett and Tegna. And so Gannett kept all the newspapers, and then Tegna was all the TV stations and some of our .coms, right? So the company was getting too big under FAA regulations, FCC regulations, and so they had to split up. And so when that happened, we did keep our familial relationships with some of the newspapers. And so we started doing company-wide investigations. And this is the first time that I had experienced that. But where investigative reporters from our sister companies, our sister stations all over the country did a piece of the investigation, okay? And so one of the first things that we looked into as a team with our teams at USA Today was the high cost of insulin. And this came right after the EpiPen hearings on Capitol Hill, right? So a Washington, D.C. reporter got an interview with the FDA. I found a local family who had a diabetic daughter, and looked into what our state legislators, our representatives in Washington and senators were taking from Big Pharma. Okay, so this is two stories. And this is the other thing we started doing. Instead of doing one story that just ran on the 10 o'clock news, we started doing multiple versions of the story for every show, and then different versions for the story online, right? So I did one investigation on girls with autism and started looking at the numbers and shedding light on those numbers. And I did 7 versions of that story for different digital outlets that we had, right? So that's the next story. What now? I'll tell you, and that's the very next story, because that was the next thing I looked into. So how we got this particular story, though, was a team effort, right? I found the local family. Someone in his state found the doctor who has the website, and then, of course, someone in Washington went and got the interview with the FDA head. And we shared through our system the interviews, and then each person in whatever market they happened to be in could pull whatever sound bites worked for their particular story, right?
Can you name names about what South Carolina?
Absolutely. That's in this story. So the next thing I did was go look and see who was taking donations, and not only who was taking donations, but how they voted when it came to bills that were for the consumer or for Big Pharma. Exactly. So let's see who it is. So when I looked at those bills, though he had the most money, Jim Clyburn was the only person who voted for the consumer every single time. Everyone else voted against the consumer and for Big Pharma. And then I pointed out the one time that Lindsey Graham voted for the consumer. Every other time it was for Big Pharma. I said so I looked at probably 5 bills at that point in time that really would have been good for the consumer had they passed, right? Jim Clyburn was the only one who voted in favor, right, of depending on what the bill was, right, for the consumer every single time. Everyone else of our delegation voted for Big Pharma every single time, except for the one time that I showed you in the piece that Lindsey Graham voted with Jim Clyburn on that particular bill. Yeah. Exactly. It does beg that question, right? So as a journalist, all I can do is produce the numbers, right? Show you what I found, and then leave it up to you to make your mind about that. Now, why was he receiving the most money? If I had to guess, I'd say it was because he's been in Congress longer and has more power, right? That's why I would guess that. The other people had not been in Congress as long. And he votes against the Big Pharma, yet they still give him money. So I guess he's taking the money and running. Yeah. Potentially. I mean, we're not in his mindset, potentially, for sure. Right.
Someone voting against it, we've seen many bills in Congress that are full of so much
Other stuff, right? Right. And we know the reason those bills are put, there's two reasons bills have amendments to them, right? One, because somebody wants to get something for their constituents, right? That has nothing to do with the bill. And the other one is to prevent the bill from being passed, right? Those are the two main reasons, right? So yes, we don't know their mindset, so we don't know why they voted a certain way. All we know is that they voted that way, right? And so my job as a journalist is to present that to the viewer and let them make up their own minds about that, right? Yeah. Yes. Which, I mean, it cost $1 to make. It cost $1 to make, right? She said last week Biden did an executive order to make insulin $45, cap it at $45. And it cost $1 to make. But the reason it was so much was because the company, the companies that produce it, paid FDA, right, for the exclusivity of it, right? So they're pushing these drugs through. They're paying these bills, paying these fines to get these drugs pushed through. And if you remember what the doctor in the first piece said, that's about 60%, 2/3 of the FDA's budget. And so I didn't take his word for it. I went and looked at the FDA budget, and it is in fact about that much, right?
There's no generic insulin now.
Now there is, but before there wasn't, right? Because one of the laws passed by Congress didn't allow generic to be made, and no generic could be made because of the agreement with FDA.
There's all kinds of it.
Now there is, but that's only been, what, a couple of years? Exactly, yeah.
Why does the Greenville News not report how these people are voting?
That's a good question. You should ask the Greenville News that, right? Because these are the important things that we need to know about. We can all find it out, right? But it does take time, and who has the time, right? But this is why investigative journalism is so important now. Flint, Michigan water crisis never would have had light shed on it if a local newspaper reporter hadn't kept going after the story, even when someone told them that there was no story there, right? That just gave me goosebumps, right? That's how important it is. Yeah. So this is why we need investigative journalism in our society, is to shed the light on these things that we as the general population don't know that's happening, that it's happening right in front of us, but behind closed doors, right? And sometimes right in front of us in open doors, right? Okay. So as a result of these company-wide investigations, certain companies are then creating their own investigative units, their own investigative shows. WXIA in Atlanta created the Triangle, which looked at the opioid epidemic and really did a fabulous series on really triangulating the 400% increase in opioid addiction and deaths in the triangle between Alpharetta, Atlanta, and I can't remember what the other city is. But they have a whole website for it, although some of the stories since are just appearing on the WXIA website. So they've created this whole investigative arm. And Gray Television is doing the exact same thing. Tegna has Verify, which I'll show you right here real quick. Tegna, which is the company that I worked for that used to be Gannett. No, ABC is owned by Disney. CBS is owned by Comcast, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry, the state? I'd have to find that out. I'm not sure who owns them. Yeah. Probably, I had to guess, maybe Gannett. So this is Verify. And this came about as kind of a fact checker, which is investigative journalism, right? So we'll just look at how they go about their bills, how they go about their stories. So what's the one I looked at earlier? We'll look at this one. So they do lots of stories like this, kind of down and dirty, quick. Let's check this. Let's show our sources. Let's be transparent.
Florida House Bill 999
Sorry.
is causing a stir on social media. Multiple viral.
And one of the things that I feel like I did well in my career was that I was transparent about how I did my work, right? Because people need to understand how journalists get their stories. I built my reputation on it, and I feel like it was a good reputation. But you will see in those stories that I showed you, I show you the actual calls I'm making to people. I'm showing you those calls. I'm showing you me looking at the data and figuring out the data and collecting the data. That notebook that I had was full of all of the responses that I got from all the firefighters. My last investigation that I never got to finish before I retired was I was looking into what's called skimming, where medical professionals in some form or fashion, nurses, doctors, people who work in a doctor's office, somehow steal pain medication. So the way that I came across that particular story was I had a surgery. And I noticed that my nurse was being very sloppy. And so I was in pain, and I asked her what the doctor had said, and she said, well, he said to give you two pain pills, but I'm only going to give you one. And my first thought is, okay, why are you not following doctor's orders, right? So then I started watching her, and I realized later that she gave me an Advil instead of the hydrocodone, right? And so I watched, right? And this was before they do the scan thing, right? And so I reported her. And then I found out this is called skimming. So, and it wasn't the first time she had been reported for it. So then I called DHEC and did a FOIA and asked for the people in the last 5 years, the investigations of skimming in the last 5 years that DHEC had opened. And I received all of that data, and I was in the process of going through it. And can I just tell you, there was a lot of it, a lot of investigations that they had opened. She was not charged because she ended up leaving that hospital, and it was never leaving that particular hospital. And that's what happens is they go from one to the other. They never went into it that deep, right? But she did end up leaving the hospital. It was Lexington in Columbia. But the reason I noticed it is because she was acting very sloppy, like she was taking stuff off and just leaving things sharps and stuff, leaving things around my room. And I'm like, this is not how things are done. So I started watching her. And then I thought, well, what about, I'm pretty young to be having a surgery. What about all the other people in here who aren't as alert as I am and who pay attention to things like this, right? Because I pay attention to everything. And that's when I called and filed the complaint. And then I started the investigation, right? So we've gone to one-man band investigations, right, to entire teams, because that's what it takes nowadays to get things done, especially since we're in such a national and even global economy or society, that I couldn't have gotten the FDA person for that story, right? Even though that story needed to be done, people in South Carolina needed to see that story, right? But we also needed the FDA person to explain that, right? So... all right, I think we have a few more minutes to questions. I talked a long time. Sorry, guys. Yeah, we have, or are we over? How long are we supposed to be? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Because the saying is, and always has been, the more things change.
The more they stay the same.
Yeah. But there may be some other questions that you have. And at this time, if you would like to have any other, yes, a question. Okay, I can answer questions. About Mary Shelley, and it's a professor of literature who is an expert on the life of Mary Shelley and her works in the Romantic Age. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Gotcha.
And the month after that, so we have Mary Shelley next month, and the month after that, Harry Houdini. And I can, I'm sorry, I said Harry Houdini. It's not Harry Houdini.
You're Harry Houdini.
That was last year,
Yeah.
it was Harry Houdini. This year, it is, Robert Ripley. Believe it or not, we're going to have Robert Ripley as the focus. And the slides will be about the unbelievable life of Robert Ripley and how he has created an international concern. Yeah, so, yes.
They 100% do. Exactly, which is why I reported her, right? But nothing that I knew ever came of it. Yeah. I can't believe she didn't either. Yeah, exactly. Really, it was he said, she said, because at that time they don't have, you know how now they have the scanners and they keep track of everything? At that time, they didn't have that. And it was really, and she even questioned, the lady who took my took my report even said, how do you know? And I said, because I'm wide awake and I'm in pain and I'm very cognizant. I'm an investigative reporter and I pay attention when I think things are wrong. Yeah.
Okay, yes, and I think we have a question right over here. Yeah.
That's a good podcast. Yeah.
So a recommendation that we tune in to the History Chicks, a website, a podcast site.
Yeah.
Episode 20, Nellie Bly on the History Chicks. So make a little note of that. You'll get extra information.
But you
when
for
meet
sure
Nellie.
will see similarities in how which is why I went into detail about how I went about getting the stories and how she really laid that groundwork for us to be able to do that. Right.
Any other? Yes, sir. Microphone right over there.
Thank you. How does one in your profession manage to keep up their hope about the future when every day you bump up against a seamy side of life that probably 90% of us
You
sitting
do.
in the audience did not experience in our professional life? That's a personal question that you don't have to answer with any specificity. However, if you have a comment, we would welcome it.
I'm happy to answer that. In my discovery of firefighters with PTSD, I found out the other group that has PTSD in addition to soldiers and first responders is journalists. And the reason that is there's we cover everything from fatal accidents, right? Because we had the flood, we had the Walter Scott shooting down in Charleston. I covered a quadruple murder, 2 of which are children, and 1 child that had a shot point blank range. You may remember that story. I covered that story. We had the Mother Emanuel Church shooting. I mean, and all of that happened back to back to back, right? We had in 2015. And then, so that was a tough year, right? So one, you have to kind of compartmentalize things just like first responders do. But journalists do get something called cumulative PTSD, which is also what first responders do, because the tragedies aren't necessarily happening to you, but you see them. Like I covered a court case and the evidence was horrific. And you have to detach yourself a little bit from that. But then when something happens to you, then all of that hits you like a Mack truck sometimes, right? And so you'll hear stories, and I've had personal experience with it, where if something happens to you, I had a rollover accident, right, in a work truck, that this girl ran a red light and hit me and rolled over, and everybody thought I was dead, but I wasn't, luckily enough. But that then I had to cover a rollover accident in which somebody died. And so I'm doing my live shot and I'm almost having an anxiety attack going to this, right? And I do my live shot, everything's fine. And the minute the camera turns off, I collapse on the ground. Like I'm just physically done, right? And I'm bawling my eyes out. Because I didn't realize that it would affect me like that. But because a month before that, I'd had my own, and I was so lucky to be alive, right? That it hits you, right? So all of that stuff has been accumulating, and so you have to really do some self-care. I've learned, you can't compartmentalize it like we do for years and years, because it will come back. Yeah. Don't go there. No, I'm kidding. Any other questions? Thank you guys so much. You're a
Thank
great
you.
crowd, great questions. Thank you so much.
And be sure to pick up schedules and see when our next library productions are. And of course, in your readers, you will have all the information about the summer festival, which since spring just started, the summer festival will be here before we know it. And if you don't mind helping out a bit, if you have a chance to, with stacking the chairs back or just pulling the chairs back a bit so that we can get them all stacked up, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you all for coming.